Akron, Ohio. A cold morning settles over the city, and today the streets are hauntingly quiet. But there was a time, not so long ago, when the day here did not begin with the rising sun. It began with a siren, a single, piercing mechanical cry that rolled across the hills before dawn, vibrating through the bedroom windows of tens of thousands of families. This was the heartbeat of the rubber capital of the world, a sound that signaled not just the start of a shift, but the unmistakable reality of stability for an entire region. If you lived in this city during the first half of the 20th century, you didn't just see the industry, you inhaled it. The air was a thick, sensory cocktail, carrying the sharp, unmistakable bite of sulfur and hot rubber that workers carried home on their skin and clothes like a badge of office, a scent that for many became known simply as the smell of a paycheck. Inside the vast brick walls of the Goodrich factory, the scene was one of industrial poetry and orchestrated violence. This was an industrial cathedral of the motor age, a place where miles of conveyor belts moved in a relentless, choreographed dance, and massive presses slammed shut with a force that shook the very foundations of the houses nearby. At its absolute peak, this wasn't just a plant. It was a city within a city where 3 shifts ran around the clock, creating a world that never truly slept. Even in the dead of an Ohio winter, a thick heat shimmered above the roofs, and the windows glowed through the darkness, a brilliant beacon of grit and obsession that produced the tires, hoses, and seals required to keep an entire nation in motion. To have a Goodrich badge number was to have a family inheritance. It was the American Industrial Compact, in its most physical form, a promise that if you gave your strength to the line, the company would provide a home, a car, and a predictable future for your children. Generations of fathers trained their sons under these same high ceilings, and brothers worked side by side in the mixing rooms, believing that as long as the world needed to move, the concrete palace on the banks of the canal would remain standing. The factory had armed the nation during World War II, transforming from a commercial giant into a strategic arsenal that built the tires for tanks and the seals for warships, proving itself to be the essential skeleton of American mobility. But as you stand on East Grand Boulevard today, that rhythm of hammers and the roar of the furnaces have been replaced by the unmistakable reality of silence. The same walls that once symbolized permanence now stand as a monument to abandonment. Where the smell of industry once hung heavy, there is now only the scent of dust and rust. The windows are broken, the floors are cold, and nature has begun to reclaim the loading docks where millions of tires once began their journey to the corners of the globe. How does an industrial empire that survived the Great Depression and helped win a global war, a giant that literally defined the identity of its city, collapse from within? How does the very success of a technology trap built for a different century turn into a liability that erases 100 years of craftsmanship in a matter of decades? The fall of Goodrich is a haunting lesson in the merciless arithmetic of global scale and the devastating human cost that follows when an empire loses its place in the world. Did your father or grandfather carry a Goodrich badge? Do you still remember the vibration of the presses in your chest, or the way the siren organized the rhythm of your life? Share your family's story in the comments below. We are keeping these industrial memories alive. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the unmistakable reality of silence that eventually settled over the ruins of Akron's industrial corridor, we must first travel back to a world of fire, iron, and a different kind of grit and obsession. The Goodrich story does not begin in a corporate boardroom or a modern glass and steel office park, but in 1870, when the city was nothing more than a modest canal town. Before it was a monument to industrial ambition, Akron was merely a crossing point for movement, a place for grain, timber, and coal to pass through on their way somewhere else. It lacked a single industry powerful enough to define its identity, until a man named Benjamin Franklin Goodrich arrived with a proposal that many in the financial centers of the East Coast considered a risky bet on an unstable science. In those days, rubber was not the reliable, ubiquitous material we know today. It was a temperamental, unstable substance that seemed to defy the unforgiving mathematics of engineering. It cracked in the biting cold of an Ohio winter and turned into a sticky, useless puddle in the summer heat. Most industrial leaders dismissed it as a novelty, a material fit for small toys or specialized gaskets, but certainly not something you could build an empire upon. But the men behind Goodrich saw rubber not as a problem, but as a challenge waiting for a solution, and they chose Akron as their laboratory. The early days of the company were defined by organized chaos and a level of grit and obsession that is hard to fathom in the age of modern automation. Inside small, cramped workshops, the process was slow, experimental, and frequently disastrous. There were no computer-controlled sensors or automated mixing vats. Instead, raw rubber compounds had to be mixed by hand and cured with painstaking care. Failure was the most common result of a day's labor. Entire batches of expensive raw material would be ruined if the temperature fluctuated by even a few degrees, or if the secret formulas failed to hold. But with every ruined batch came a refinement of the blacksmith's oath, the refusal to let the name mean nothing by allowing the work to fall apart. This was the era of the technology trap in its infancy, where the science of vulcanization was being perfected to stabilize the material. By mastering this chemical stabilization, Goodrich transformed rubber from a curious novelty into a reliable, industrial-grade material. As the science improved, the ambition grew, and the industrial cathedral on the banks of the canal began to rise, brick building by brick building. Akron proved to be the right place at the right time for this monument to industrial ambition. It had the railroads to ship product, the nearby coal to power the massive boilers, and most importantly, a workforce of men from the surrounding farms and small towns of Ohio and Pennsylvania who were desperate for the unmistakable reality of a steady paycheck. They were willing to trade the seasonal uncertainty of agriculture for the hot, loud, and physically demanding life of the factory floor, a place where efficiency mattered more than comfort. Then, an invention arrived that shifted the entire trajectory of the company and the city. It was the pneumatic tire. As the bicycle craze swept across the nation, followed by the deafening arrival of the first automobiles, the demand for rubber didn't just grow, it exploded. Suddenly, rubber was no longer just a supporting industry, providing belts and seals. It was driving the very heart of American movement. The factory grounds began to stretch across entire neighborhoods, and the rhythm of hammers was joined by the relentless thud of the tire presses. Goodrich had successfully pivoted from a risky experimental shop to an institution. They were no longer just making parts. They were enabling the automotive age. But even as they celebrated their dominance, the merciless arithmetic of scale was beginning to take hold. The factory was becoming so large, so essential, and so deeply embedded in the identity of the city that its very success was creating a future vulnerability. They had built a concrete palace that appeared unassailable, unaware that the world they were building would eventually outgrow the walls they were raising. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Goodrich factory had transcended simple growth and moved into a state of total industrial dominance. It was no longer just a place of employment. It was a city within a city that dictated the very heartbeat of Akron, Ohio. If you stood outside the factory gates on a bitter winter night, you would see the windows glowing with a fierce, artificial orange, a brilliant beacon of grit and obsession that never flickered out. Inside those massive brick walls, the scene was one of industrial poetry, performed with military precision. Raw rubber arrived by the trainload, and through a choreography refined by years of repetition, it was weighed, mixed, heated, and pressed according to formulas that were as guarded as state secrets. The scale of this monument to industrial ambition was staggering. Tens of thousands of workers flowed through the massive gates in 3 shifts that ran around the clock, their faces already darkened by rubber dust before the day was even half over. Inside, the rhythm of hammers from the blacksmith era was replaced by the relentless thud of massive presses that slammed shut thousands of times a day. Supervisors tracked every minute of labor, and efficiency boards posted numbers that mattered more than names. In this world, the unforgiving mathematics of production governed every movement, shaving seconds off every task to multiply the output of the most critical component of the modern age, the tire. But for the men and women on the floor, the factory was far more than a cold machine of production. It was a promise. This was the era of the American Industrial Compact, a sacred, unspoken agreement between the company and the community that built it. To carry a Goodrich badge number was to possess a passport to the middle class. It meant food on the table, rent paid on time, a car in the driveway, and the ability to send your children to college, often the first in the family to go. A job at the plant provided predictability in a world that had known too much economic uncertainty. Even when the merciless arithmetic of a national recession hit, the rubber city endured. People might delay buying new luxury goods, but tires wore out regardless, and the work continued. The culture inside the walls was strict, hierarchical, and unforgiving. The work was hot, loud, and physically demanding, leaving the scent of sulfur and hot rubber permanently etched into the skin of the workforce. Yet, despite the physical toll, there was a profound sense of generational pride. In the neighborhoods surrounding the plant, reputations were shaped by which line you worked on and how many decades you had stayed. Fathers trained their sons at the same machines, and brothers worked side by side in the mixing rooms, viewing the concrete palace as a permanent inheritance for their families. This dominance was fueled by a level of vertical integration that made Goodrich the essential skeleton of American mobility. The factory didn't just assemble tires. It produced the myriad parts required to keep a nation in motion. From the heavy-duty hoses that fed steam engines to the delicate seals that kept hydraulic pressure contained, Goodrich was the silent partner in every industrial advancement of the era. As the bicycle craze gave way to the deafening arrival of the automobile, the demand for rubber shifted from a supporting role to a driving force of the entire economy. Goodrich engineers were not just responding to the automotive age, they were enabling it. They refined rubber compounds to withstand the higher speeds and heavier loads of the first long-distance trucks, aligning their output perfectly with the rapid expansion of the nation's infrastructure. By the time the arsenal of democracy was needed for a world at war, the Akron complex was operating at a scale that defied comprehension. Storage yards were filled with millions of stacked black rings, and rail spurs branched directly into the factory grounds to carry finished products to Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Standing at this peak, the factory appeared unassailable. It had embraced every technological change and embedded itself so deeply into the national supply chain that its disappearance felt like a physical impossibility. The buildings were massive, the workforce was seasoned, and the demand seemed infinite. From the outside, it looked like permanence made of brick, steel, and rubber, unaware that the industrial aftermath was already waiting just beyond the horizon of their success. On December 8, 1941, the unmistakable reality of global conflict arrived at the gates of the Goodrich factory with the force of an industrial explosion. Overnight, the third largest industry in America was drafted into service, and rubber was reclassified from a civilian commodity into a strategic weapon more precious than gold. In Akron, the rhythm of hammers and the thud of the presses took on a new, desperate urgency. This was no longer about making the tires that carried families to Sunday dinner. It was about building the skeleton of the arsenal of democracy. Inside the industrial cathedral on the banks of the canal, the transition was abrupt and absolute. Production lines were reconfigured in a state of organized chaos, as civilian output was paused to prioritize military contracts that demanded tighter tolerances and faster turnarounds than the world had ever seen. The factory shifted into a wartime posture, running at its absolute maximum capacity. 3 shifts worked around the clock, and the heat beneath the high ceilings became a constant, shimmering presence, even in the dead of an Ohio winter. But as the men of Akron traded their factory badges for military uniforms, a profound transformation occurred on the production floor. In a move that shattered decades of industrial tradition, women moved into roles that had previously been closed to them, deemed too heavy, too hot, or too dangerous for anyone but a man. By 1943, these women, many of whom had left kitchens, classrooms, and domestic jobs, comprised a significant portion of the 6,200 workers keeping the plant alive. They operated the massive presses, inspected thousands of tires for microscopic defects, and handled the scalding steam with a grit and obsession that proved the work was about skill and dedication rather than brute strength. For these women, the factory was more than a site of production. It was a site of economic independence, where they earned wages that were, in some cases, double what they had made before the war. While the women managed the machines, the company's engineers were fighting a different kind of battle in the laboratories. When Japan seized control of the supply lines in Southeast Asia, 90% of the world's natural rubber vanished overnight. America faced a mobility collapse, but Goodrich was already positioned at the center of a rapid industrial experiment, the development of synthetic rubber. This petroleum-based miracle, refined in months rather than years, allowed the factory to continue producing the tires, seals, and gaskets required for tanks, trucks, and the Boeing B-17 bombers that were winning the war in the skies. This era marked the absolute high water mark for the Akron plant. It had become a monument to national survival, an essential node in an invisible network that connected Pennsylvania steel mills and Texas refineries to the battlefields of Normandy and Okinawa. The output was staggering. The factory's contribution was no longer measured in profit margins, but in logistics and survivability. Every perfect shell casing and every durable tire meant that a soldier had a tool that wouldn't fail when his life depended on it. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, the Goodrich factory emerged from the conflict larger, more experienced, and more confident than ever before. It had proven its capacity under the most extreme conditions imaginable. From the outside, the buildings were intact, the workforce was seasoned, and the concrete palace seemed indispensable to the coming post-war boom. However, the very forces that had driven this wartime success, the relentless focus on speed, scale, and emergency efficiency, had also embedded deep vulnerabilities. The factory was thriving in a world of guaranteed government contracts, unaware that the unforgiving mathematics of a globalized, peacetime economy would soon turn its industrial poetry into a technology trap it could not escape. To look at the production numbers of the Goodrich Empire during the middle of the 20th century is to see a triumph of efficiency, a record of industrial ambition that appeared flawless on a spreadsheet. But to step inside those massive brick walls was to witness a sensory nightmare that no ledger could truly capture. While the public saw gleaming tires and essential rubber components, the workers saw a world defined by orchestrated violence and a level of grit and obsession that pushed the human body to its absolute limits. This was the industrial poetry of the motor age, and its verses were written in sweat, steam, and the relentless thud of iron meeting rubber. Inside the concrete palace on the banks of the canal, the air was a thick, shimmering weight. Ventilation systems existed, but they were no match for the merciless arithmetic of the brewing and curing processes. Temperatures on the factory floor regularly climbed to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In the cure rooms, where tires were baked under immense pressure in massive steam-heated molds, the heat intensified to a staggering 120 degrees with 90% humidity. Workers moved through a constant artificial fog, their uniforms soaked through with sweat within the first 15 minutes of an 8-hour shift. To survive the heat, men drank gallons of water and swallowed salt tablets by the handful, a desperate attempt to fend off the heat exhaustion that claimed victims daily during the humid Ohio summers. But the heat was only half of the nightmare. The other half was the sound. The rhythm of hammers from the early days had evolved into a deafening, continuous roar that never dropped below 95 decibels. Massive presses slammed shut with explosive force, Motors whined without interruption, and conveyor belts rattled and shook in a choreography that moved faster than human reflexes. In this world, communication was impossible through speech. Workers relied on a complex language of gestures and routines, their ears ringing for hours after they finally stepped back into the relative silence of the outside world. This was the technology trap of the era. To achieve the scale required to move a nation, the factory had to become a machine that demanded its human operators behave like steel. The very atmosphere was a chemical cocktail. Carbon black, sulfur, and volatile accelerators settled into the air like invisible snow. This dust coated every surface, every tool, and eventually, every worker. It was an unmistakable reality that you could tell a Goodrich man by the way he looked and the way he smelled. The scent was a sharp, acrid mix of hot rubber, machinery oil, and sulfur, a smell so pervasive that it followed the men home, clinging to their skin and hair despite every effort to wash it away. For the families living in the shadow of the plant, this became known as the smell of a paycheck, a sensory reminder of the American Industrial Compact. If the air smelled of rubber, it meant the furnaces were roaring, the shifts were full, and the mortgages were being paid. However, the trade-off for that paycheck was an unforgiving mathematics played out on the human frame. The work was an endurance test that extracted a physical toll year after year. Repetitive motions strained joints into chronic pain, the heat sapped vitality, and the fine particles of rubber and chemicals were absorbed into the lungs with every breath. In an era focused on output above all else, management emphasized loyalty and efficiency over long-term health. Minor injuries, crushed fingers, burned arms, and strained backs were seen as the inevitable cost of progress, part of the blacksmith's oath that workers accepted in exchange for a middle-class life. By the late 1950s, this brutal reality had become a way of life for tens of thousands. They took pride in their mastery of the machines and their ability to endure conditions that would break lesser men. They were a blue-collar aristocracy, earning wages that allowed them to buy the very cars they were helping to equip. Yet, beneath the pride and the steady paychecks, the seeds of the industrial aftermath were already being sown. The factory was a monument to grit and obsession, but it was also a place where the damage was being paid in installments over a lifetime in shortened breath, failing hearing, and bodies that were wearing out just as the global economy was preparing to move on without them. The machines were at their loudest, but the unmistakable reality of silence was waiting just a few decades away. The most dangerous forces inside the Goodrich factory were not always the ones you could see, hear, or feel vibrating through the floorboards. They didn't announce themselves with the explosive slam of a tire press or the screaming whine of a high-speed motor. Instead, they settled quietly into the air, into the skin, and eventually into the very lungs of every man and woman who walked through those gates. This was the chemical ghost of Akron, an invisible presence that haunted the industrial cathedral on the banks of the canal for more than a century. Rubber manufacturing was, at its core, a violent act of industrial chemistry, and that chemistry came with a cost that the merciless arithmetic of the era chose to ignore. To transform raw, unstable rubber into the durable, heat-resistant tires that moved the nation, the factory relied on a volatile cocktail of compounds. Sulfur, accelerators, and evaporating solvents were the invisible gears of the production process. But the most pervasive of all these forces was the carbon black. It was a fine, powdery soot that drifted through the mixing rooms like a dark, microscopic snow, coating every surface, every tool, and every worker in its path. It was an unmistakable reality that you could tell a Goodrich man by his eyes. The black dust settled into the creases of the skin so deeply that no amount of industrial soap or scrubbing could ever fully wash it away. For the workers, this dust was more than a nuisance. It was an atmospheric poison. While protective equipment like masks and gloves technically existed, they were often viewed as a hindrance to the grit and obsession required to meet production quotas. On a factory floor that regularly climbed to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, Wearing a thick, heavy respirator felt like a different kind of suffocation. Many workers chose speed and comfort over protection, a decision encouraged by supervisors who prioritized output above all else. What resulted was a slow-motion crime, a poisoning so gradual that the victims often had no idea they were being destroyed until it was too late. The effects were subtle at first, a persistent cough that never quite cleared, a nagging headache that lingered long after the shift ended, or skin irritations that became a permanent part of a worker's life. But the chemistry of the motor age was patient. The particles and fumes inhaled in the 1950s and 60s didn't wait for a convenient time to manifest. They accumulated molecularly, binding to the body in ways that the medical understanding of the time was ill-equipped to track. By the time the unforgiving mathematics of biology caught up, the results were devastating. Decades later, patterns of respiratory diseases and cancers began to emerge among the retired workforce, appearing like echoes of the shifts they had worked 20 or 30 years prior. These were not accidents that could be settled with a single insurance claim. They were the terminal installments of a debt paid in human health. Yet, for a long time, these consequences were shrouded in a culture of silence that was as thick as the sulfur in the air. In a rubber city like Akron, to question the safety of the plant was to question the very foundation of the community's survival. Complaining about the conditions carried a heavy social stigma. A worker who spoke too loudly about his failing health risked being labeled as unreliable or ungrateful. The Goodrich factory was the hand that fed tens of thousands, and the American Industrial Compact dictated that you did not bite that hand, even if it was slowly poisoning you. Individual cases of illness were treated as isolated misfortunes or personal bad luck, rather than signs of a systemic failure. Questioning the industry felt like questioning the future of the city itself. The people of Akron accepted the smell of a paycheck and the dust on their skin as the inevitable price of progress, unaware that they were part of a living experiment with no exit strategy. The machines were at their loudest, and the prosperity was at its peak, but the chemical ghost was already writing the final, tragic chapter of the Goodrich legacy, a chapter that would be read in hospital wards long after the furnaces had gone cold. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the unmistakable reality of a shifting world began to press against the brick walls of the Goodrich Industrial Cathedral in Akron. For decades, the plant had operated as the undisputed heartbeat of the city, but the American Industrial Compact was beginning to show visible signs of wear as labor relations hardened on the factory floor. As working conditions became more widely discussed and health concerns gained a new level of legitimacy among the rank and file, the workforce began to organize with a newfound assertiveness. Unions pushed for higher wages, shorter hours, and significantly stronger safety standards, leading to a fracture in the long-standing rhythm of hammers. Negotiations that had once been relatively straightforward grew increasingly tense, and strikes that were once brief and manageable became longer, more disruptive events that rippled outward to affect suppliers, distributors, and the very stability of the city itself. Inside the executive offices, the merciless arithmetic of the industry was dictating a different set of priorities. Management saw the rising costs of labor, expanding benefits, and the mounting expense of complying with new industrial regulations as a direct threat to the company's survival. The Goodrich factory, a monument to industrial ambition built for the logic of a previous century, was now facing the brutal reality of the technology trap. To remain competitive in a rapidly accelerating market, the facility required massive capital investment to modernize its aging infrastructure. However, every decision to upgrade was a gamble of unforgiving mathematics. Installing new automated machinery often required shutting down active production lines, which meant a loss of output that the tightening margins could no longer absorb. The trap was closing from both sides as the unmistakable reality of globalization arrived at the gates of Akron. Overseas manufacturers were emerging with a lethal combination of lower labor costs and gleaming state-of-the-art facilities that allowed them to produce tires at prices the Ohio plant simply could not match. Advances in shipping and global logistics effectively erased the geographic advantages that had once protected domestic factories from foreign intrusion. Akron was no longer the undisputed center of the rubber universe. It was suddenly just one player in a sprawling, hyper-competitive global operation. This shift in scale triggered a profound change in corporate strategy, as decisions were increasingly made far from the heat and noise of the factory floor. Executives began to weigh costs across global portfolios, viewing the Akron plant not as the heart of the company, but as a single node in a spreadsheet governed by financial metrics. The sacred industrial compact of loyalty, which had once been mutual, began to feel increasingly one-sided to the thousands of workers who still carried the scent of hot rubber home every night. Inside the plant, morale began to erode as workers sensed that the era of permanence was slipping away. Promotions slowed, maintenance schedules were deferred, and the grit and obsession that had built the empire was replaced by a growing sense of anxiety and mistrust. Environmental regulations added another layer of grinding pressure to the system. Standards for waste disposal and emissions tightened, requiring the company to spend capital on retrofitting old buildings just to stay compliant, money that the board preferred to spend on expansion or innovation in newer, more flexible regions. The system was trapped between a past it couldn't let go of and a future it couldn't afford to build. By the early 1970s, the decline of the Goodrich factory began to manifest not as a sudden collapse, but as a series of adjustments disguised as efficiency. Production lines would shut down for retooling and never reopen. Departments were consolidated, and overtime slowly evaporated into the unmistakable reality of silence. The factory still stood, and the machines still ran, but the foundation of certainty was gone. Akron was learning a bitter lesson of the industrial aftermath, that a monument to industrial ambition can become a liability the moment its scale makes it too rigid to adapt to a world that no longer rewards place, but only the merciless arithmetic of the lowest cost. By the late 1970s, the decline of the Goodrich factory in Akron did not arrive with a single, dramatic lock on the gate or a sudden, explosive press conference. Instead, it arrived in a series of quiet, clinical adjustments that were carefully disguised as efficiency. To the outside world, the company spoke the language of modernization and strategic consolidation, but on the factory floor, the workers saw an entirely different, unmistakable reality. They watched as a production line would be shut down for what management called retooling, only to notice that the lights in that section never came back on. The machines were not being upgraded. They were being mothballed, left to gather dust while the work was quietly shifted to newer facilities in regions that offered lower costs and fewer regulations. This was the era of grinding pressure, where the merciless arithmetic of global competition began to hollow out the industrial cathedral from the inside. Maintenance schedules, once treated as sacred, began to slip into the realm of organized chaos. When a gear stripped or a motor burned out on an aging tire press, there was no longer a budget for a proper replacement. Instead, maintenance crews were forced to perform a kind of industrial triage, salvaging parts from the inactive lines to keep the remaining ones moving for just a few more weeks. The factory, once a monument to industrial ambition, was now surviving on endurance and improvised repairs, a technology trap where the cost of truly fixing the system was deemed not economically attractive. For the workers, this period was a psychological war of attrition. The American Industrial Compact, the belief that loyalty would be rewarded with permanence, was being shredded one memo at a time. Layoffs did not come in a single event, but in relentless waves that struck with short notice and vague, hollow promises of recall. One Friday, a notice would appear on the bulletin board announcing that 300 workers were being furloughed due to market volatility. But as the months turned into years, those workers realized the recall was a strategic mirage. Each wave of layoffs took a deeper bite out of the seniority list, erasing the security of men who had spent 20 or 30 years breathing the hot rubber air of Akron. The impact of this managed decline rippled outward from the factory gates, fundamentally altering the working-class neighborhoods that had grown up in the shadow of the smokestacks. In districts where you could once tell time by the rhythm of the plant's siren, the silence began to settle in like a terminal illness. Fewer paychecks meant fewer purchases at the neighborhood butcher shops and corner diners. The small businesses that had thrived for generations, the places where a Goodrich man would buy his work boots or a celebratory round of drinks after a shift, began to cut their hours or shutter their doors entirely. The hollowing out was visible in the very fabric of the streets. For sale signs multiplied on the small two-bedroom bungalows that had been the pride of the blue-collar aristocracy. But in a city where the main employer was retreating, there were few buyers. Property values collapsed, and the municipal tax base eroded, leading to a death spiral of reduced city services and crumbling infrastructure. The younger generation, seeing the writing on the wall, began to flee Akron, taking their ambitions to newer industrial hubs, while those who remained were often the ones with the least ability to relocate, workers whose health had been traded for those now vanishing paychecks. Inside the plant, the atmosphere shifted from grit and obsession to a heavy, guarded resignation. Conversations in the break room were no longer about sports or family, but about rumors of the next department merger or the latest executive visit from distant offices. The managers no longer spoke to the workers. They spoke past them, using the detached language of spreadsheets and unforgiving mathematics. The concrete palace still stood, and the siren still sounded, but the rhythm of hammers had been replaced by the sound of a system liquidating its own legacy. Akron was learning the bitterest lesson of the industrial aftermath, that a company can grow so large that it loses its soul, and when that soul is gone, the community that built it is the first thing to be sacrificed on the altar of the next quarterly report. The final days of the Goodrich factory did not feel historic while they were happening. They felt ordinary, and that was precisely what made them devastating. For over 100 years, the gates on East Grand Boulevard had opened with a mechanical certainty that governed the lives of tens of thousands. But by the late 1970s, that rhythm had slowed to a crawl. Inside the vast halls, where the air had once shimmered with the heat of 110 degrees, a new and unsettling cold was beginning to settle into the concrete. The reduced workforce reported for duty, moving through familiar corridors that now echoed with an unmistakable reality of absence. What had once been crowded aisles, vibrant with the grit and obsession of 3 shifts, were now wide, quiet, and haunted by the ghosts of industrial ambition. Workers noticed the end long before the final whistle blew. It was in the empty lockers, the unused break rooms, and the machines that were powered down one by one, never to be restarted. There were no grand speeches or cameras on the floor. Instead, the shutdown was documented in carefully written, emotionally distant notices taped to the bulletin boards. The management language remained clinical, speaking of consolidation and timelines, but for the men and women on the floor, the meaning was simply a long, slow goodbye. These final shifts carried a quiet, heavy dignity. Men who had spent 30 or 40 years navigating these same aisles walked the floor slowly, noticing details they had ignored for decades. Names scratched into steel railings and worn steps, polished smooth by the boots of 3 generations. They touched the machines, those massive, oppressive presses that had shaped their lives and bodies, feeling the cold iron as if committing the texture to memory. The hierarchy that had governed the plant for a century softened. Titles like supervisor or foreman no longer mattered when everyone was facing the same coming silence. When the last production run finally ended, there was no celebratory siren. The machines were powered down in a methodical graveyard sequence. Motors spun to a stop, and the presses cooled until the only sound remaining was the faint, ghostly echo of metal settling and air escaping as the building adjusted to its own stillness. It was the sound of an industrial ecosystem finally collapsing inward. The final walkout occurred just after dawn. It was unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside, just a small group of people passing through the gates for the last time. They carried their personal items in dented steel lunch pails, jackets, a few hand tools they were allowed to keep, and yellowed photographs that had been taped inside lockers for 25 years. They did not look like the architects of an empire. They looked like veterans leaving a battlefield they no longer recognized. As the last man stepped onto the sidewalk, the massive steel doors were pulled shut with a dull, final thud that vibrated through the pavement one last time. The padlocks snapped into place, and for the first time since 1870, the heartbeat of the rubber capital stopped. The machines were silent, the workers were scattered, and the city of Akron was left to reckon with the unmistakable reality that the work which built it had vanished into the dust of history. The factory was no longer a place of making. It was now a monument to abandonment, holding its breath while the world moved on without it. Years after the last shift ended, the Goodrich factory remains standing on the banks of the canal in Akron, but it no longer feels like a place of creation. It has become a landmark of absence, a pause in the city's story that never resolved. Passing the plant today means confronting a lifetime condensed into ruins. The buildings, once vibrant with the grit and obsession of tens of thousands, are now just empty shells of brick and steel, holding their breath while nature slowly reclaims the loading docks. The silence is not peaceful. It is heavy, with the weight of decades of labor, ambition, and sacrifice compressed into stillness. Where the roar of machinery once drowned out thought, there is now only the hollow whistle of the wind through shattered windows. Rain pools on concrete floors where massive machines once stood, and paint peels in long strips, revealing layers from different decades, each one marking a period of expansion that everyone believed would last forever. The legacy of Goodrich is a story of three distinct paths. For the first group, often the younger workers, the closure came early enough to bend rather than break. They carried their mechanical aptitude and industrial discipline to new states and new sectors, finding ways to rebuild their lives, though rarely with the same level of middle-class security they had once expected. For the second group, those in mid-career, the closure was a slow-motion hollowing out. Too old to start over easily and too young to retire, they remained in Akron, cycling through temporary jobs and short-term contracts. They watched their savings and their certainty evaporate into the merciless arithmetic of a service economy, carrying the memory of what had been lost into every new, smaller position. And then there was the third path, the hardest one. For these workers, the closure was a terminal ending, a body worn down by 110-degree heat and the chemical price of progress. They were left with respiratory problems, joint pain, and hearing loss, facing a world that no longer valued their mastery. For them, the concrete palace was not just a former employer. It was the place where they had traded their health for a paycheck that had finally stopped clearing. The tragedy of the rubber city reminds us that industrial success carries an obligation that cannot be captured in a quarterly earnings report. Akron grew around rubber by design, aligning its education, its infrastructure, and its very identity to serve a single purpose. But that same dependence created a vulnerability. When the markets globalized and the technology trap of aging facilities became too expensive to escape, the city discovered that excellence is not a shield against the horizon. Innovation alone cannot defeat the structural reality of scale. You can invent the pneumatic tire, you can develop synthetic rubber during a world war, and you can build a monument to industrial ambition that spans neighborhoods, but if the system moves toward a different logic of distance and cost, you can still be erased. The Goodrich story is a haunting mirror of a broader American pattern. It proves that industry can anchor a city for a century, provide stability across generations, and shape identity as powerfully as geography, and yet, it can still disappear without ceremony if the systems that support it are replaced. Today, the silent factory continues to ask a question that the modern economy prefers not to answer. How should progress account for the people who make it possible? The machines have stopped, the workers have scattered, and the rhythm of hammers has been replaced by reflection. Goodrich is gone, but the lesson endures. Past glory does not protect your future, and some things, once destroyed, can never be rebuilt. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of fire, precision, and the silence of the forge are worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what your city's landmark of absence is. We are keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching.